What happens when one of comedy's biggest legends sits down for what should be a friendly late-night interview, only to find himself facing a host who seems determined to tear him down piece by piece. What starts as typical celebrity banter quickly spirals into something much darker, as old wounds are reopened and professional respect crumbles in real time. The tension in the studio becomes so thick you could cut it with a knife. And by the end, one of these comedy giants will storm off stage, leaving everyone wondering what they just witnessed. But before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which late-night host you think handles controversial guests the best. Because trust me, you're going to want to discuss this one. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was running like clockwork that evening. The audience was buzzing with anticipation as they waited for the night's biggest guest, Eddie Murphy, to make his entrance. Murphy had been making the rounds promoting his latest project, and everyone expected this to be another lighthearted chat filled with laughs and nostalgia. The comedian had been doing interviews all week, charming audiences with stories from his legendary career, from his Saturday Night Live days to his blockbuster movies. Everything seemed perfectly normal as the show's familiar theme music played, and Colbert delivered his opening monologue with his usual sharp wit. But something felt different the moment Eddie Murphy walked onto that stage. While the audience erupted in applause and Colbert flashed his trademark grin, there was an underlying tension that even the most casual viewer could sense. Murphy's smile seemed forced, and Colbert's greeting, while outwardly warm, carried an edge that suggested this wasn't going to be the typical celebrity love fest that late-night television usually serves up. "Eddie Murphy, everybody," Colbert announced as Murphy settled into the guest chair. "It's great to have you here. You know, I have to say, watching your career over the years has been quite the journey. From the raw, unfiltered comedy of your early stand-up to the family-friendly movies, it's been quite an evolution, hasn't it?" The way Colbert emphasized the word evolution made it sound less like a compliment and more like a critique. Murphy's expression shifted slightly, his media-trained smile faltering for just a moment before he responded. "Well, Stephen, I think any artist grows and changes over time. That's what keeps things interesting, you know. I've always tried to connect with audiences, whether that's through edgier material or something the whole family can enjoy." Right. Colbert nodded, but his tone suggested he wasn't buying it. "But some would say that growth, that evolution you mentioned, it's really more about playing it safe, isn't it? I mean, when was the last time you took a real risk with your comedy? When did you last push boundaries the way you used to?" The audience grew noticeably quieter. This wasn't the playful ribbing that guests usually received on late-night shows. This felt more like an interrogation, and Murphy's body language showed he was picking up on it too. "I think I take risks all the time," Murphy replied, his voice still controlled, but with a slight edge creeping in. "Maybe they're just different kinds of risks than what I took when I was 25 years old. Maturity changes your perspective on what's worth risking." "Maturity," Colbert repeated, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I sit, it looks more like you've spent the last 20 years trying to distance yourself from the very thing that made you famous in the first place. The raw honesty, the willingness to offend, the courage to say what others wouldn't dare say." Murphy's jaw tightened visibly. "I'm not sure what you're getting at here, Stephen. What I'm getting at is this sanitized version of Eddie Murphy that we've been getting for decades now. The guy who used to be fearless on stage, who would tackle any subject, no matter how controversial. And now we get what? Talking donkeys in fat suits. It's like watching a lion that's been declawed." The comparison hit its mark. Murphy leaned forward slightly, his media-trained composure beginning to crack. "You know what, Stephen? I think you might have the wrong idea about what courage and comedy actually means. It's easy to throw stones from behind a desk at someone else's career choices, but when you're the one putting yourself out there, when you're the one whose name is on the marquee, when you're the one responsible for creating opportunities not just for yourself, but for other people, sometimes the brave choice is knowing when to evolve." "Evolve?" Colbert shot back immediately. "There's that word again. But evolution suggests moving forward, getting better, becoming more advanced. What you've done feels more like regression. You went from being this groundbreaking, influential voice in comedy to being, well, safe, predictable, commercial." The word commercial hung in the air like an accusation. Murphy's hands gripped the arms of his chair, and for a moment, it looked like he might stand up and leave right then and there. But instead, he took a deep breath and fired back. "You want to talk about commercial, Stephen? Let's talk about your show. This whole setup, This desk, this format, it's the same thing that's been done for 60 years. Where's your evolution? Where's your risk-taking? You're basically doing a slightly more smug version of what Johnny Carson did, except at least Carson had the decency to be charming while he was doing it. The audience gasped audibly. Colbert's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by a cold stare that could have frozen water. That's interesting coming from someone who's made the same movie 15 times with different costumes. At least my movies make people laugh, Murphy shot back. Your show mostly just makes people feel superior to whoever you're mocking that night. There's a difference between comedy and condescension, though I can see how you might get them confused. The tension in the studio was now palpable. The audience didn't know whether to laugh, gasp, or sit in uncomfortable silence. Colbert's producers were probably scrambling in the control room, trying to figure out how to salvage what was supposed to be a routine celebrity interview. You know what, Eddie? Colbert said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. I think what really bothers you is that someone's finally calling out what everyone in this industry has been whispering about for years. That somewhere along the way, Eddie Murphy, the guy who used to be comedy royalty, decided to settle for being comedy's court jester. Murphy's eyes flashed with anger. And I think what really bothers you, Stephen, is that despite all your Ivy League credentials and your supposed intellectual superiority, you'll never have the impact on comedy that I had by the time I was 25 years old. You can hide behind your writers and your research team and your teleprompter all you want. But at the end of the day, you're just another talk show host in a long line of talk show hosts. I'm Eddie Murphy. The way Murphy said his own name with complete confidence and zero apology seemed to infuriate Colbert even more. You were Eddie Murphy, he corrected. Now you're just someone trading on past glory while refusing to acknowledge that your best days are decades behind you. That was the line that shouldn't have been crossed. Murphy stood up from his chair, and the entire studio fell silent. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every moment of what was quickly becoming one of the most uncomfortable television moments in recent memory. The silence in the studio was deafening as Murphy stood there, towering over Colbert's desk. For a moment, it seemed like he might actually walk away right then and there. But instead, something even more dramatic happened. Murphy slowly sat back down, but this time he leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, looking directly into Colbert's eyes with an intensity that made everyone in the room uncomfortable. You know what, Stephen? I was going to let that slide, but I think we need to have a real conversation here. You want to talk about my best days being behind me? Let's talk about what those days actually were. Let's talk about a 20-year-old kid from Roosevelt, Long Island, who walked into Saturday Night Live and changed comedy forever. Let's talk about someone who created characters that are still being quoted 40 years later. Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, the Buckwheat sketches, Mr. Rogers' parodies that were so good they made Eddie Anderson himself laugh. Colbert tried to interrupt, but Murphy held up a hand and continued, his voice getting stronger with each word. Let's talk about Raw and Delirious. Two comedy specials that redefined what stand-up comedy could be. Not just for black comedians, not just for edgy comedians, but for all comedians. I didn't just push boundaries, Stephen. I obliterated them and then redrew the map. And you want to sit there and tell me about courage, about risk-taking. Those were different times, Colbert interjected. But his voice lacked the confidence it had earlier. What worked then wouldn't work now. Society has evolved. Society has evolved. Murphy laughed. But there was no humor in it. Society has gotten scared. You mean comedy has gotten timid? And shows like yours are part of the problem. You sit behind this desk every night taking safe shots at easy targets, preaching to a choir that already agrees with you. Where's the risk in that? Where's the boundary pushing and making fun of politicians that half your audience already hates? The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This had gone far beyond typical late-night banter. This was a masterclass in verbal warfare, and Murphy was just getting started. You want to know why I made those family movies? Because I had something to prove that you'll never understand. I had to prove that a black comedian from New York could carry a $100 million movie. I had to prove that I could make white kids in suburban theaters laugh just as hard as black kids in inner-city theaters. I had to prove that I could be more than just the angry black comedian that white audiences felt safe laughing at because I was contained on a stage. Colbert's face was getting redder by the minute. So you're saying your artistic choices were driven by race? I'm saying my artistic choices were driven by reality. Murphy fired back immediately. Something you've never had to deal with. You think I wanted to put on fat suits and play multiple characters? You think that was my artistic vision? That was me proving that I could disappear so completely into characters that audiences would forget they were watching Eddie Murphy. That was me showing range that most comedians could never dream of. But at what cost? Colbert pressed, apparently unable to help himself. You went from being this authentic voice to being this calculated entertainer. Murphy's laugh was sharp and bitter. Authentic? You want to talk about authentic? What's authentic about you, Stephen? What's authentic about this whole setup? You're playing a character right now, the concerned interviewer, the thoughtful host, the guy just asking the tough questions. But we both know what this really is. This is you trying to take down someone you see as comedy old guard to make yourself feel more relevant. That's ridiculous, Colbert said. But his denial sounded weak. Is it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've built your entire career on being the smartest guy in the room, the one who gets to explain to everyone else why they're wrong. And maybe that works with politicians and authors and whatever other guests you usually have on here, but I've been in this business longer than you've been out of college, and I can smell insecurity from a mile away. The camera operators were getting incredible footage. Every expression, every microreaction, every moment of tension was being captured in high definition. Colbert's producers had to be having heart attacks in the control room. But they couldn't look away either. You know what your problem is, Eddie? Colbert said, his voice getting colder. You can't handle the fact that comedy moved on without you. The Eddie Murphy style of comedy, the shock value, the offensive material, the crude humor, it's not what audiences want anymore. They want something smarter, more sophisticated, more socially conscious. More socially conscious, Murphy repeated, his voice rising. You mean more sanitized, more focus-grouped, more approved by committees of people who have never made anyone laugh in their entire lives? You think your comedy is sophisticated? Your comedy is comedy for people who are afraid to laugh too hard in case someone thinks less of them. At least my comedy doesn't rely on outdated stereotypes and offensive caricatures, Colbert shot back. That was another line that shouldn't have been crossed. Murphy stood up again, but this time he didn't sit back down. He walked around the desk, getting closer to Colbert, and the host visibly tensed up. Outdated stereotypes. Murphy's voice was dangerously quiet now. You want to talk about stereotypes, Stephen? How about the stereotype of the condescending white liberal who thinks he knows what's best for everyone? How about the stereotype of the privileged guy who went to fancy schools and thinks that gives him the right to lecture people who actually came from something? I never claimed to come from anything other than what I came from, Colbert said. But he was clearly rattled now. No, you just act like where you came from makes you more qualified to judge where I came from. You act like your perspective is more valid, more enlightened, more evolved. But here's what you don't understand about evolution, Stephen. Real evolution isn't about becoming what other people think you should become. Real evolution is about becoming who you were meant to be, despite what other people think. Murphy walked back toward his chair, but he didn't sit down. Instead, he stood behind it, gripping the back with both hands. I evolved from a kid who had nothing to someone who could create opportunities for hundreds of other people. I evolved from someone who was told he'd never be more than a novelty act to someone who proved that comedy has no color, no boundaries, no limits except the ones we impose on ourselves. You evolved from someone with potential to someone who uses that potential to tear down the people who paved the way for you to even have a show. That's not what this is about, Colbert insisted. But his voice was getting weaker. Then what is it about, Stephen? Because from where I'm standing, this looks like a man who's jealous of someone else's legacy, trying to diminish it to make himself feel better. This looks like someone who knows he'll never be remembered the way I'm remembered. So he's trying to rewrite history to make my accomplishments seem smaller. The tension in the room was reaching a breaking point. Colbert was gripping his desk so tightly, his knuckles were white, and Murphy looked like he was barely restraining himself from saying something that would end both their careers. Colbert finally snapped. Something in Murphy's last words hit a nerve that ran deeper than professional rivalry, and suddenly the composed intellectual host facade crumbled completely. You want to know what this is really about, Eddie? Colbert's voice was shaking with barely controlled rage. This is about accountability. This is about someone finally having the courage to tell you that your comedy hurt people, that your material promoted harmful stereotypes that set back progress for decades, that your success came at the expense of marginalized communities who didn't have the platform to fight back. Murphy's eyes narrowed dangerously. Don't you dare try to turn this into some social justice crusade. Don't you dare sit there and pretend you're speaking for anyone but yourself. You know what hurt people, Stephen? Poverty hurt people. Lack of opportunity hurt people. Being told you weren't good enough, smart enough, or acceptable enough hurt people. Comedy didn't hurt anyone. Comedy gave people a way to laugh at the things that were actually hurting them. That's a convenient way to avoid responsibility, Colbert shot back, his voice getting louder. Hide behind the idea that comedy is just comedy, that entertainment exists in a vacuum, that your words and actions don't have consequences in the real world. Consequences. Murphy walked closer to the desk again, his voice rising to match Colbert's. You want to talk about consequences? The consequence of my comedy was that it opened doors for dozens of other comedians who looked like me. The consequence was that it proved black performers could carry major motion pictures. The consequence was that it created opportunities in an industry that had spent decades keeping people like me on the margins. And what about the other consequences? Colbert pressed, leaning forward aggressively. What about the young people who internalized those stereotypes? What about the communities that were mocked and caricatured for cheap laughs? Murphy slammed his hand down on Colbert's desk so hard that everyone in the studio jumped. Don't lecture me about my community. Don't you dare sit there and tell me about the impact my work had on people who look like me. People who came from where I came from, people who lived the experiences I was talking about. You think you understand the black experience better than I do? You think your analysis is more valid than my lived reality. The audience was completely silent, afraid to even breathe loudly. This had become something far more intense and personal than anyone could have anticipated. I'm not claiming to understand anyone else's experience, Colbert said, but his voice was defensive now. I'm just saying that impact matters more than intent, and the impact of some of your material was harmful, regardless of what you intended. Impact matters more than intent, Murphy repeated, his voice dripping with contempt. That's the kind of thinking that's killing comedy, Stephen. That's the kind of logic that says we should judge art not by what it was trying to accomplish, but by how the most sensitive person in the room might interpret it. That's how you end up with comedy that's so afraid of offending anyone that it doesn't connect with anyone. Maybe that's better than comedy that connects by punching down, Colbert fired back. Punching down? Murphy's voice exploded. Punching down. I was punching up, Stephen. I was a poor kid from Long Island making fun of the absurdities of the world I was trying to break into. I was commenting on my own experiences, my own community, my own struggles. The only person punching down here is you. Using your platform to attack someone's entire life's work based on standards that didn't even exist when that work was created. Colbert stood up from behind his desk, matching Murphy's energy. Those standards existed, Eddie. Some of us just had the courage to follow them even when it wasn't profitable. Courage? Murphy laughed. But it was a harsh, angry sound. You call it courage to play it safe? You call it courage to only take risks that have been pre-approved by focus groups and social media campaigns? Real courage is getting on stage with nothing but a microphone and your own truth, knowing that half the audience might walk out, but believing that your truth is worth telling anyway. Your truth, Colbert repeated mockingly. What if your truth hurt other people's truth? What if your platform came at the cost of silencing voices that didn't have platforms? Then those voices should have created their own platforms instead of waiting for permission. Murphy shot back immediately. That's what I did. Nobody handed me anything, Stephen. Nobody said, here, Eddie. Take this career. You deserve it. I fought for every opportunity, every stage, every movie, every moment in the spotlight. And now you want to diminish that because it doesn't fit your idea of how success should be achieved. I want to hold it accountable because success without responsibility is just selfishness, Colbert countered. Murphy stared at him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was quiet but filled with disgust. You know what, Stephen? I've spent 40 years in this business, and I've met a lot of people who didn't like me, didn't like my work, didn't think I belonged where I was, but I've never met anyone quite like you. I've never met someone who could take someone else's success and make it about themselves so completely. This isn't about me, Colbert protested. Everything is about you. Murphy exploded. This whole interview has been about you. Your moral superiority, your intellectual authority, your right to judge and condemn and lecture. You invited me on your show not to celebrate my work or even to have a real conversation about it, but to use me as a prop in your ongoing performance as the conscience of comedy. Murphy walked toward the edge of the stage, then turned back to face Colbert one last time. You want to know the difference between us, Stephen? I made people laugh when they needed it most. I gave them permission to find joy in difficult times, to see humor in their struggles, to feel less alone in their experiences. What do? You make people feel smarter than other people. You give them permission to look down on anyone who doesn't share their exact worldview. That's not comedy, Stephen. That's just intellectual bullying with better ratings. Colbert's face was red with anger and embarrassment. If you can't handle being challenged on your material, maybe you shouldn't be doing interviews. Challenged? Murphy shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't a challenge, Stephen. This was an ambush. This was you using your show as a platform to prosecute someone for the crime of being successful in a way you don't approve of. And you know what? I don't have to sit here and take it. Murphy started walking toward the exit. But Colbert couldn't help himself from getting in one last shot. Walk away, Eddie. That's what you've been doing for years anyway. Walking away from anything that might actually challenge you to grow. Murphy stopped dead in his tracks. For a moment, it looked like he might turn around and continue the fight. Instead, he spoke without turning back. No, Stephen. What I've been doing for years is walking towards something, building something, creating something that will outlast both of us. You'll spend the rest of your career tearing down what other people built. I spent mine building something that can't be torn down, no matter how hard people like you try. And with that, Eddie Murphy walked off the stage, leaving Stephen Colbert sitting alone behind his desk with an audience that didn't know whether to applaud or sit in stunned silence. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Colbert's face as he realized what had just happened before finally cutting to commercial. The interview that was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance had become something much more significant. It had become a defining moment for both men. A line drawn in the sand about what comedy was, what it should be, and who gets to decide. And based on the reaction of everyone in that studio, it was clear that only one person had walked away from that confrontation with their dignity intact. So, what do you think about this incredible confrontation? Have you ever seen a late-night interview go this wrong before? Drop a comment below and let me know which moment from this clash shocked you the most. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories about the moments when Hollywood politeness falls away and we see what celebrities are really made of.